Hello, this is another one of my videos on Parker's short history of the Second World War, this one dealing with the question of guilt in the murder of the European Jews. It comes from a very long chapter 17, which I've divided into 6 sections and videos, and we're now on to the 4th in that series. When Anthony Eden, the British Foreign Secretary, read the Allied statement to the UK House of Commons, the question of responsibility was raised, one MP interrupting to blame the whole German nation. But most Germans, on average, were probably far more ignorant of the evil work of their government than the populations of the countries it oppressed. Listening to radio broadcasts from London was far more common in countries like France, Belgium and the Netherlands than in Germany. There was also a greater faith in Germany in the rectitude of German authorities and scepticism towards statements made by the Allies. However, there were respectable Germans in important positions who could not have avoided knowing about much of the killing process, and whilst they might secretly regard the Nazis with disdain, they made no move to stop what was happening. They included high-ranking bureaucrats and also some of the directors of the major companies which employed Jewish slaves in their factories. Some may have been keen anti-Semites who approved of what they knew, but if not, they persuaded themselves that individual resistance or protest was futile. Also, elements of the army, particularly staff officers in rear echelons and units engaged in anti-partisan work, actively cooperated in mass shootings in Eastern and Southeastern Europe, persuading themselves that killing Jews helped the repression of anti-German resistance. Even in countries whose populations hated the Germans, whether as allies or as occupiers, and these two categories became increasingly the same, most people didn't understand what was happening to the Jews. Neither did most of the victims, who either didn't know or refused to allow themselves to know. Thus we have the sad story of one historian in the Warsaw Ghetto in August 1942, who dismissed details of the extermination procedure at Treblinka, explaining that in past periods of stress, whole communities have been swept away with fears without any basis in fact. Or again, in the Lodz Ghetto in September 1943, Jacob Poznański wrote in his diary that people commonly exaggerated the situation and denied the possibility that the Jews were being murdered en masse. Or in March 1944, Edith Klebinder, deported from Lyon in France to Auschwitz, believed that she was being merely sent to work in Germany. She was selected for the work camp and survived, but the children and old people who had travelled with her were gassed upon arrival. Especially in those countries which retained some degree of independence, the Reich Security Head Office needed the cooperation of the local police and administrators. Thus in Bulgaria, Romania and France, the local authorities would not help the Germans to capture relatively long settled or assimilated local Jews, but not those who were recent arrivals. In Hungary, the destruction process only began in 1944, when faced with the approach of the Red Army, the Germans seized control and bullied the Hungarians into acquiescence. In the Netherlands, the Dutch administration and police generally did what they were told, but in Belgium they didn't, recalcitrant officials saving the lives of many Jews, even though they were mostly foreigners and therefore more vulnerable. In Italy and areas under Italian occupation, the Jews were safe until the Germans took over or imposed a neo-fascist state under a puppet Mussolini with its own brutal squads. In these cases, only a few high-up fanatical pro-Nazi collaborators are likely to have known what was going on. For example, Joseph Darnand, the organizer and de facto leader of the collaborationist Vichy government's paramilitary police force, who helped the Germans when the regular police refused to. Others, especially those of high authority, didn't try to know. whilst few of their subordinates who actually carried out the deportations believed that they were sending the Jews to their deaths. Hungarian policemen who queried why they should be deporting Jewish babies and old women for labor were reassured by the SS that the Jews worked better when not separated from their families. This said, there was, in a number of instances, cases in which the local police were extremely brutal in the deportation process. So we should distinguish between the process of deportation and the eventual sending of the victims to the death camps. Few grasped the full horror of the final solution, but what was visible was appalling. Goods trains packed with victims moving to an unknown future. Many of those who helped in this process were fully conscious accomplices in these swift and brutal actions. And even as late as 1943 and 1944, they may have persuaded themselves that the Germans were genuinely transporting the Jews for work rather than extermination, as the Germans were also combing Europe for regular workers to be deported to Germany. For example, in April 1944, Admiral Horthy, the Hungarian regent, assured a worried archbishop of this, stating that not a single hair on the heads of the Jews would be harmed. In actuality, 400,000 deported Hungarian Jews were gassed over the next 3 months. There were also Jews who became accomplices of the Nazis, spying on their fellows, denouncing hidden Jews, or hunting them in exchange for the always unreliable offer of privileged exemption from deportation for themselves. But critical to their project, the Nazis used Jews as local ghetto leaders, where they created Jewish councils. These were to list, assemble, organize, and tranquilize their Jews. These officials were deferred deportation, could choose others for deferment, and were encouraged to hope for permanent exemption. Such elders might cooperate for entirely unselfish reasons, believing that the only hope they had for the survival of their community was through disciplined conformity. Even if they were aware of the killings, they might see no hope in resistance or evasion, but they could play for time, postponing a worse fate, which might in the end not occur. They acted as they thought was best. For the Germans, such visions served their purpose, and they might mouth soft words of deceit to support them. Thus, on the 31st of March 1944, Eichmann told the Central Hungarian Jewish Council that no harm would befall their community if they showed a proper attitude, a message of hope that was widely disseminated amongst the Jews, causing them to ignore warnings from the small number of Jewish resistors. In Belgium, the anti-Jewish resistance attacked the Jewish Council, destroying its register of Jews, and killed the official responsible for selecting Jews for labor detail. Although most of those involved in the murder of the Jews were not conscious accomplices, they knowingly participated or acquiesced in the ruthless and often brutal uprooting of Jewish communities and families across Europe. So thank you for listening. Particular thanks to my patrons for their kind support and encouragement. Without them, I wouldn't be able to make these videos. If you want to support my channel, you're very welcome to do so. Please do like, comment, and share on the videos themselves. Subscribe if you want to be notified of future videos. I'll give Patreon and PayPal links below in case you want to provide practical support. Next week, we'll turn to the topic of those who help Jews. Thank you.